It was a sunny Monday morning in a small town in Virginia. The air was fresh, and the streets were calm as people went about their daily routines. James Carter, known by most as Jim, was a retired U.S. Army veteran. At 72 years old, he had lived a long and honorable life. He had served his country with pride during 2 wars and had received several medals for bravery. Now, in his retirement years, he enjoyed the little things, reading the newspaper on his porch, feeding the birds, and running errands on his own. Jim had a habit of going to the grocery store every Monday morning. He preferred the early hours when the store wasn't too crowded. That morning, he wore his usual outfit, a plain gray hoodie, jeans, and his Army veteran cap. The cap was worn but clean, with a golden emblem in the center. He walked slowly with the help of a cane. His right knee still gave him trouble from an injury he got while serving overseas. But he never complained. As he made his way through the store, several people greeted him. He was well liked in the community, especially by the older residents, who respected his service. Even some of the younger store employees knew him and offered to carry his bags. But Jim was proud. He always said, "If I can walk, I can carry a bag." After buying milk, bread, a few fruits, and his favorite morning coffee blend, Jim slowly walked back to the parking lot. His car, an old but well-maintained sedan, was parked near the entrance. He placed the bags in the back seat and leaned on the car door for a moment to catch his breath. The sun was rising higher, casting long shadows across the pavement. At that exact moment, Officer Daniel Brooks was patrolling nearby. He was a young police officer, fresh out of training with less than a year on the force. That morning, he had received a call about a suspicious person in a hoodie outside the grocery store. The caller didn't give much details, just said someone looked out of place and seemed to be lurking. It was a vague call, the kind that happens often and usually turns out to be nothing. But Brooks, eager to prove himself, responded quickly. He drove up to the parking lot, scanning the area. When he saw Jim leaning against the car in a hoodie, he made a fast assumption. Without thinking twice, he pulled over, got out of his car, and started walking toward. Jim saw the officer approach but didn't think much of it at first. He assumed the young man might be asking for directions or maybe just making conversation. But then, things changed fast. The officer's hand was on his weapon and his voice was sharp. "Hey, step away from the vehicle," he shouted. Jim looked confused. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice calm. "Show me your hands. Right now. Don't reach for anything," Brooks ordered. Jim raised both hands slowly. One. Still holding his cane. "Sir, I'm just putting groceries in my car. Haven't done anything." But Brooks had already drawn his gun. Several people nearby stopped in their tracks. A young couple who had just left the store froze as they watched the officer point a gun at the elderly man. A teenage girl began recording the scene with her phone. "Drop the cane. Step back. Face the vehicle," Brooks shouted again. Jim looked stunned. "Son, I can't drop the cane. I need it to stand." The officer's hand trembled slightly on the trigger. His voice was louder now, almost panicked. "I said, drop it. Don't make me repeat myself." The crowd began to grow. A woman shouted, "He's a veteran. That man served our country." Another man yelled, "Why are you pointing a gun at him? He didn't do anything." But Brooks wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on Jim and his brain was filled with assumptions. All he saw was a man in a hoodie who didn't respond fast enough. He didn't see a 72-year-old war hero. He didn't see a beloved community member. He only saw a threat. Jim, meanwhile, stood perfectly still. His heart was racing, but he didn't want to make any sudden moves. He knew too well what could happen if a black man made the wrong move at the wrong time. All his years of training taught him to stay calm, even in the face of danger. Officer Jim said quietly, "I am unarmed. I'm a retired Army veteran. This is a misunderstanding." But Brooks didn't lower the weapon. "You're resisting. Turn around and get on the ground." "I can't get on the ground," Jim replied. "My knee suddenly." Another officer arrived. Officer Linda Reyes had been nearby and heard the call. As soon as she stepped out of her car and saw the scene, her eyes widened. She recognized Jim right away. She had met him at a town hall meeting just a few months ago, where he spoke about veterans' rights. "Brooks, put the gun down," Reyes shouted as she ran toward them. "That's Mr. Carter. He's a veteran." Brooks looked confused, but still kept his weapon raised, not complying. Reyes moved in front of Brooks, putting herself between the gun and Jim. "Put it down. He hasn't done anything." Finally, Brooks lowered his weapon, still breathing heavily. Reyes walked over to Jim. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Carter. Are you okay?" Jim nodded slowly, though his hands were still trembling. "I think so." By now, more bystanders were filming. The teenage girl had captured the entire scene from the moment Brooks drew his weapon to the point where Reyes intervened. Within minutes, the videos were already being uploaded to social media. The situation had unfolded in less than 10 minutes, but it would change lives forever. Jim sat down on the edge of his car seat as Reyes helped him catch his breath. She offered him a bottle of water, which he took with a shaky hand. Several people approached to make sure he was all right. One man said, "This is wrong. You don't treat people like that. You don't treat heroes like that." Brooks stood off to the side, silent now, his face pale. He didn't say a word. He was beginning to understand what had just happened. Jim stayed at the scene for another half hour while higher-ranking officers arrived. Statements were taken, and Brooks was pulled aside for questioning. Jim was offered a ride home, but he chose to drive himself. He wanted to leave quietly, without more attention. But as he drove off, he noticed more people arriving, some coming to support, others to demand answers. Later that afternoon, Jim sat in his living room, the same room, filled with military photos, folded flags, and a cabinet of medals. He looked at the news on his TV. His name was already trending online. The video had gone viral. He watched himself on the screen, an old man in a hoodie, standing still while a gun was pointed at him. He watched himself try to speak calmly, watched the fear in his own eyes. It didn't feel real. His phone rang. Non-stop calls from friends, fellow veterans, reporters. But Jim didn't answer. He just sat quietly, remembering the moment the barrel of that gun stared back at him in all his years serving his country. He had faced danger in foreign lands. He had fought for freedom, for justice, for peace. Yet here in his own country, in his own neighborhood, at a grocery store he visited every week, he was treated like a criminal because of a hoodie, because of the color of his skin, because someone called in a vague report. As the sun set that day, Jim walked to his porch and sat in his old wooden chair. His cane rested by his side. The birds came to feed, just like every other day. But something had changed in the air. Something had broken inside him. Something he didn't know if he could ever fix. He wasn't angry yet. Not fully. Mostly he was tired. Tired of a life where respect had to be earned twice as hard, where dignity was always at risk. Down, he also felt something else starting to rise, a quiet, steady fire. Because this time, the world had seen it happen. And the world wasn't staying quiet. The morning after the shocking event outside the grocery store, James Carter woke up early. He hadn't slept well. All night he had replayed the scene in his mind, the sudden shout, the gun in his face, the confused look on the young officer's face, and the voices of the people in the background. Every moment felt sharp, fresh, and painful, like a cut that wouldn't close. It was still hard to believe it had really happened. He stood at his window and looked outside. His quiet neighborhood looked the same as always, calm and clean. Birds were chirping, and the early sun was shining through the trees. But Jim felt different. He felt exposed, not just because of what had happened, but because now the world had seen it. His phone had started ringing before the sun was fully up. At first, he ignored it. Then it buzzed with messages, texts from old friends, calls from veteran buddies, and voicemails from local news stations asking for interviews. He didn't answer any of them, not yet. His head was still full, and his heart was still heavy. Around 9 a.m., his neighbor, Mrs. Dorsey, knocked on his door. She was holding a phone in one hand and a newspaper in the other. She looked worried, but also full of energy, like she was ready to march into battle. "Jim," she said, "you're all over the internet. Everyone's talking about you." Video people are furious. He didn't say anything at first. He just took the paper from her. Right there on the front page was a picture of him standing beside his car with his hands in the air and a police officer aiming a gun straight at him. The headline read, "Veteran held at gunpoint by police. A community in shock." Jim stared at the photo. He almost didn't recognize himself. He looked small, weak, even frightened. That wasn't the man he saw in the mirror every day. Wasn't the soldier who had led teams in dangerous missions, or the man who had helped build a better life after returning from war. But that image was real. It had been caught, frozen forever. Mrs. Dorsey placed a hand on his shoulder. "People are angry, Jim. They want answers. Some are already gathering at City Hall. They're calling it injustice. They want that officer fired." Jim sighed. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," she replied. "But sometimes the truth grabs the world whether we're ready or not." Later that morning, Jim finally opened his laptop and searched his own name. What he saw stunned him. There were videos all over social media platforms. One video, posted by a teenage girl named Kayla, had already been viewed more than 3 million times. The caption read, "This is how they treat our heroes. Disgusting." People were commenting from across the country, some expressing shock, others sharing their own painful experiences with racial profiling or police violence. The support was overwhelming. Thousands of people were writing, "We stand with Jim," or "Not one more. Enough is enough." News reporters were already using phrases like unjustified use of force, racial profiling, and dangerous policing. National outlets like CNN, MSNBC, and even international news organizations had picked up the story. Some commentators were calling for the police officer's badge. Others were saying this could be a turning point in the city's conversation about racism and policing. Veterans groups began posting statements. One powerful tweet from a national military organization said, "We are deeply disturbed by the mistreatment of Mr. James Carter, a decorated veteran and a patriot. No one who served this country should ever be treated this way. We demand justice." By noon, Jim's porch was filled with local reporters, activists, and supporters. Some brought flowers. Others held signs saying, "Justice for Jim, end police racism, and protect our veterans." Jim stayed inside, watching through the curtains. He didn't want to become a symbol. He had lived quietly for years, proud but private. Now all that had changed overnight. His granddaughter Alana arrived around lunchtime. She had driven in from the next town as soon as she saw the video. "Grandpa," she said, rushing in and hugging him tightly, "I thought I was going to lose you. When I saw that video, when I saw that gun, I couldn't breathe." Jim held her quietly. They didn't need many words. The fear they both felt had been real. Alana sat down beside him. "I know this is overwhelming, but maybe it's time. Maybe this moment was meant to shine a light on what so many go through." Ch nodded slowly. "Maybe, but I wish it hadn't been me." She gave him a small smile. "You always taught me to stand tall, no matter what. Maybe it's time to help others stand too." That evening, Jim agreed to speak to one reporter from a local TV station. He didn't want cameras in his home, so they met quietly in a nearby park. The reporter, a kind woman named Carla, had covered the town for years and knew Jim from his work with local veterans, sitting on a bench beneath a large oak tree. Jim told his story. He spoke slowly, carefully choosing his words. He described the moment the officer pointed the gun at him, how frozen he had felt, how humiliated, how powerless. "I didn't raise my voice," he said. "I didn't resist. I didn't threaten anyone. I just stood there, wondering how a man in uniform could look at me and not see who I was." Carla asked what scared him most. Jim looked off into the distance. "I've seen war. I've seen enemies. But I never thought I'd fear for my life in a grocery store parking lot, in the country I fought for." When the interview aired later that night, people all over town stopped what they were doing to watch. Jim's quiet voice, his calm dignity, and his deep pain touched hearts everywhere. It wasn't just a story about one man anymore. It was about something bigger. Across the city, discussions began to heat up. Churches, community centers, and even schools were talking about what had happened. Town council members were flooded with emails. The mayor's office received hundreds of phone calls, demanding an immediate response. Meanwhile, the police department released a short statement saying the incident was under review. But people were not satisfied. They wanted action. The very next morning, a peaceful protest began outside the police station. Veterans stood in uniform beside young activists. Local musicians brought drums. Teachers, parents, students all walked together holding signs that read, "Enough is enough," and "Jim deserves justice." People chanted Jim's name not in anger, but in unity. That same day, Officer Daniel Brooks was taken off duty. An official investigation was announced. But the public wasn't willing to wait quietly. They wanted to know why a man like Jim, who had given everything to his country, could be treated like a threat simply because of the color of his skin and the hoodie he wore. Back at home, Jim tried to stay grounded. He appreciated the support. But it still felt strange to be in the center of so much attention. Every time he turned on the news, he saw his own face. People were calling him a hero, a symbol, and even a spark for change. But Jim didn't see himself that way. To him, he was just a man who had survived something that never should have happened in the first place. Still, something was beginning to shift inside him. For years, he had kept quiet about the small and large injustices he had faced. Like the time he was followed around a store, or when he was stopped for looking suspicious while walking home from church. He had told himself to stay calm, to stay respectful. He believed that with age and service came safety. Now he wasn't so sure. One evening, a group of young men knocked on his door. They were local college students who had organized part of the protest. They came to thank him. "Mr. Carter," one of them said, "your story is opening eyes. People are finally listening. Thank you for your strength." Jim invited them inside. They sat in his living room, surrounded by old photographs and medals. He shared stories from his service, but also listened to their fears, their hopes, their dreams for a better future. As they left, one of them said, "You're not just a veteran, sir. You're a leader." That night, Jim sat on his porch again. The sky was clear and the stars were out. He looked up and thought about how fast life could change. Just 2 days ago, he was running errands. Now he was part of a national conversation. He still felt tired. The fear from that day hadn't fully gone away. But he also felt something else, a sense of responsibility. He whispered to himself, "If they're listening, I'd better speak the truth." The sun had barely risen when the city started buzzing again. It had been just 2 days since the video of James Carter's confrontation with Officer Daniel Brooks went viral. People across the country had already formed strong opinions. Some were angry, some heartbroken, and many were motivated to take action. What happened next was faster and louder than anyone expected, including the people at City Hall and the local police department at the center of it all. Jim Carter remained calm. While the outside world boiled with emotions, he sat quietly in his home, trying to hold on to peace. His phone still rang almost every hour. More reporters wanted interviews, more people wanted his opinion, and more neighbors wanted to stop by and offer their support. But Jim kept to himself, still thinking about that terrifying moment in the grocery store parking lot, the cold voice of the officer, the trembling barrel of the gun, the disbelief in his own heart. But outside his front door, change had already started to move. On Wednesday morning, a crowd of over 200 people gathered in front of the police department. This wasn't an ordinary protest. It was full of different voices, veterans in uniform, mothers pushing strollers, students carrying homemade signs, older residents wearing "I Stand with Jim" t-shirts. Some had tears in their eyes, some were chanting, and others simply stood in silence with signs that read things like "Protect our elders," "Justice for Jim," and "No badge for racism." The story had become national, but for the people in Jim City, it was personal. It wasn't just about one officer pointing a gun at one innocent man. It was about years of quiet injustice, about stories that had never made it to the news, about feelings people had kept buried for a long time. And with Jim's calm dignity leading the way, they felt like it was time to speak up. In the middle of the crowd stood a young woman named Kayla, the same girl who had recorded the original video on her phone. She stood on a crate and spoke to the crowd through a loudspeaker. Her voice was full of emotion. "I didn't know Mr. Carter before that day," she said. "But I knew what I was seeing was wrong. That man is a veteran. He served this country. He deserved respect, not fear. I recorded that video because I knew it needed to be seen. And now it's up to us to make sure something changes." The crowd clapped and cheered. People nodded in agreement, and some wiped away tears. Jim wasn't there, but everyone could feel his presence. Inside the police department, the pressure was building. The police chief, Anthony Russell, sat in a room with senior officers and city officials. Everyone was nervous. The video had done damage they hadn't expected. They had seen public anger before, but never like this, not so fast, not so loud, and not so justified. The mayor had already called, demanding action. The governor's office had also sent a message, asking for a clear and immediate response.
Chief!
Russell was an older man with 30 years of service behind him. He knew the job, and he knew how quickly a mistake could grow into a storm. He had seen bad decisions before, but this one felt different. The image of a white officer pointing a gun at an elderly black veteran. While that man stood helpless with a cane in his hand, it was something no amount of policy explanation could clean up. By noon that day, the police department made a public announcement. Officer Daniel Brooks had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. But people weren't satisfied with just leave. The public wanted consequences. They wanted to know how someone like Brooks had passed training, why he had reacted with such aggression, and what the department was going to do about it now. Meanwhile, Brooks himself was hiding from the public eye. He hadn't returned home. Since the video went viral, his family had received threats, and his face was now shown across every major news network. Friends stopped texting him. Some officers who had supported him in the past now kept their distance. His world was falling apart. He sat alone in a small motel room on the edge of town, watching news reports about himself. The same video played. Over and over, him shouting, pointing his weapon, his face tight with fear and tension. Every time he saw it, his stomach dropped. He didn't know how to feel anymore. Part of him felt angry that his life was ruined. Another part felt guilty. He couldn't deny what he saw in the video. The man he had aimed his weapon at had done nothing wrong. In fact, he looked nothing like the person described in the vague call that came into dispatch. But Brooks had acted anyway, too quickly, without thinking. He had judged based on race, fear, and biosand now. The world had seen it. Back at City Hall, a special meeting was held. Council members, legal advisors, and the mayor all gathered behind closed doors. They reviewed the video again, read community letters, and listened to legal opinions. By the end of the meeting, a decision had been made. That same afternoon, an emergency press conference was called. People gathered outside as cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes. The mayor stood at the podium, looking serious. "Today, we face a moment of truth," he began. "The actions of Officer Daniel Brooks were unacceptable, unprofessional, and dangerous. They do not reflect the values of our police department or our city. Effective immediately, Officer Brooks has been terminated from the force." Gasps and cheers came from the crowd. Some clapped, some shouted, "Justice." Others hugged each other. The mayor continued, "This incident has reminded us that trust must be earned and protected. We are beginning a full review of department, training, and community policing policies. We owe it to Mr. Carter and to every citizen in this city to make sure this never happens again." The announcement spread fast. Within minutes, the news hit every major outlet. Headlines flashed across screens. Officer who pointed gun at elderly veteran fired. News anchors described the firing as swift and unusual. Police departments didn't often act so quickly, especially in small towns. But this time, public pressure had forced their hand. Jim, sitting at home, watched the live broadcast with his granddaughter. When he heard the words, "Officer Brooks has been terminated," he felt a strange mix of emotions. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "I didn't want revenge," he said quietly. "I just wanted the truth to matter." His granddaughter held his hand. "It does matter, Grandpa. You made it matter." That evening, something unexpected happened. People began to gather outside Jim's house not to protest, but to show support. They brought candles, flowers, and thank you cards. Some left notes on his porch calling him a hero. Others stood quietly on the sidewalk, holding candles and praying. One little boy placed a handmade sign by the gate. It said, "Thank you, Mr. Carter, for being brave." Jim looked out the window and felt overwhelmed. He had lived his whole life trying to stay out of the spotlight. He didn't ask to become a symbol. He didn't want to become a viral story. But now that it had happened, he hoped it would mean something. The next day, local churches, schools, and community centers held discussions about what had happened. Teachers asked students to write essays about justice. Pastors spoke about courage and truth. Even police officers, who had never questioned their training before, started asking deeper questions about fear, race, and responsibility. It was as if Jim's experience had opened a door that had been locked for too long in one small town. One act of injustice had sparked a movement. Meanwhile, Officer Brooks remained out of public view. Alone, jobless, and disgraced, he had begun to realize that his career might be over forever. But more importantly, he was finally starting to understand the harm he had caused, not just to one man, but to an entire community at the same time. Jim began receiving invitations to speak. Veterans groups wanted to hear his story. Civil rights organizations asked him to share his experience. Even city officials wanted his opinion on how to improve police-community relations. For years, Jim had lived quietly, keeping his painful memories locked away. But now, the world wanted to hear his voice. And slowly, carefully, he began to find the strength to speak not with anger, but with wisdom. He didn't want anyone to feel what he had felt that day in the parking lot. He didn't want fear to live in the hearts of young black men or the hands of scared young officers. He wanted something better. And now, maybe, there was a chance for it. The journey was just beginning. But something important had already changed. A man with a cane and a worn veteran's cap had stood tall without raising his voice. And in doing so, had reminded an entire city and maybe even a country of what justice really looks like. Days turned into weeks, and the story of James Carter and Officer Daniel Brooks continued to ripple through the community, the city, and beyond. What had started as a terrible incident in a grocery store parking lot had now become a powerful conversation about race, justice, and change. Jim felt the weight of the attention growing heavier. The cameras were no longer just at the police station or city hall. They were following him everywhere. He received invitations to speak at public events, on radio shows, and even on television. Each time, he spoke calmly and clearly, sharing his experience and the lessons he had learned. He wanted to make sure people understood something important. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been judged unfairly, about the fear many black people lived with every day, and about how a system could hurt people instead of protect them. Despite the growing spotlight, Jim stayed humble. He remembered the nights in his military barracks when he and his fellow soldiers talked about honor and respect. He believed that no matter what happened, he had to carry himself with dignity. His life had been full of challenges, but he never wanted to let anger or hate define him. Instead, he focused on healing and helping others heal. One afternoon, a group of young people from a local high school invited Jim to visit their class. They had been learning about civil rights, history, and the power of peaceful protest. When Jim arrived, the students greeted him with wide eyes and respectful silence. He saw in them the hope of a new generation, one that might grow up in the world where respect was automatic. It's not earned through struggle. He told the students about his time in the military, about the battles he had fought overseas, and about the peace he hoped to find at home. He described the day when the officer had pointed a gun at him not as a story of pain, but as a lesson in courage and dignity. A student named Marcus raised his hand. "Mr. Carter," he said, "how did you stay calm when that officer pointed a gun at you?" "I don't think I could have." Jim smiled softly. "It wasn't easy, Marcus. I was scared, yes. But I knew that if I showed fear, things could get worse. I thought about my family, my country, and my own values. Sometimes when you feel powerless, the only power you have is in how you respond. The students listened carefully. Some took notes, others simply watched, soaking in every word. When the class ended, several students came forward to shake his hand and thank him. Outside the school, Azim felt a strange mix of hope and responsibility. He understood that his story was no longer just his on it, belonged to everyone who wanted change at the same time. The city's police department was undergoing deep changes. The firing of Officer Brooks had been just the beginning. The chief announced new training programs designed to help officers better understand cultural differences and unconscious bias. The department started holding public meetings to hear concerns directly from the community. For many officers, this was new and difficult, but most understood that something had to change. Jim was invited to speak at one of these meetings. Standing in front of a room full of police officers, city officials, and residents, he shared his story again. He spoke not to accuse or blame, but to encourage understanding. "I don't believe every officer is bad," he said. "Most are good people, trying to do their jobs. But good intentions aren't enough if they cause harm. We have to listen, learn, and change. That's the only way forward." Some officers nodded. Some looked thoughtful. Others avoided eye contact. The conversation was honest and sometimes uncomfortable, but Jim believed it was necessary. Meanwhile, the community organized more peaceful protests, workshops, and town halls. People of all ages and backgrounds came together to talk about race, policing, and justice. The city began to feel more connected in some ways, even as it struggled with the wounds that had been opened. For Jim, the most surprising moment came one evening when he received a letter. It was from the family of Officer Brooks. The letter was short and sincere. Brooks' parents had written to apologize for their son's actions and to express their own pain over what had happened. They said they hoped their son would learn from his mistakes and that they wished Jim healing and peace. Jim was touched. He knew forgiveness was a long road, but he felt that even in the hardest moments, kindness could open a door. That same week, Jim was invited to participate in a new city program designed to build better relationships between police and communities of color. It was called the Bridge Builders Initiative. The idea was to bring together veterans, community leaders, police officers, and young people to talk honestly about their fears, hopes, and experiences. At the first meeting, Jim sat across from several officers, including a few who had been skeptical of the changes at first. They talked about their childhoods, their fears about safety, and their hopes for their communities. Jim listened carefully, then shared his own story, not just about the day the gun was pointed at him, but about his life, his values, and his desire for peace. The conversations were sometimes hard. There were moments of tension, silence, and disagreement. But there were also moments of connection, a shared laugh, a nod of understanding, a handshake. Over time, the group began to build trust. They started organizing community events together, like neighborhood cleanups, youth sports leagues, and family picnics. Slowly, barriers began to break down. Jim felt proud to be part of something that could grow into real change. He thought about the future, about the young people he had met, about the officers willing to listen, and about the community coming together. But he also knew the road ahead was long. Change wouldn't happen overnight. There would be setbacks, mistakes, and moments of pain. Still, the seed had been planted, and it was growing. One day, Jim was asked to speak at a national veterans conference. When he stood in front of hundreds of other veterans from across the country, he talked about his experience with honesty and hope. He told them that even though he had faced injustice, he still believed in the promise of America, the promise of fairness, respect, and freedom. He urged fellow veterans to stand up for justice, to use their voices to help those who couldn't speak for themselves, and to build bridges in their own communities. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. Back home, Jim's family noticed a change. In him, he was still calm and humble, but there was a quiet strength that had grown. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was leading. Even in the moments when memories of that day in the parking lot tried to weigh him down, Jim found ways to keep moving forward. He spent time gardening, reading, and writing letters to young people, encouraging them to stay strong and kind. One afternoon, Jim received a call from a young black man who wanted advice. The man had faced discrimination himself and was feeling hopeless. Jim listened patiently, then shared words that had helped him. Don't give up. Your life matters. Your voice matters. Keep standing tall. Jim knew that stories like his could inspire change, but only if people listened and acted. He also knew that every person, no matter how small or quiet, could make a difference. As the months passed, the city slowly began to heal. The police department continued its reforms. The community stayed engaged. And Jim Carter, once just an ordinary man, had become a symbol of courage, dignity, and hope. His journey was far from over, but he had already shown that even in the darkest moments, light could shine through. The story of James Carter and Officer Daniel Brooks had become something much bigger than anyone imagined. What started as a terrifying moment had turned into a movement for change, a conversation that reached far beyond the city streets and into the hearts of people everywhere. But the journey was not easy. The final chapter was filled with hope, struggle, and new beginnings. As the weeks turned into months, the city that had been shaken by the incident began to transform. The police department's new policies and training programs were now fully in place. Officers attended regular workshops about racial bias, cultural awareness, and community communication. It was a big change from the old days when many officers never talked about these issues openly. Some officers resisted at first, feeling that these trainings were unnecessary or unfair. But others welcomed the chance to learn and grow. Slowly, the atmosphere inside the department started to shift. One afternoon, James Carter was invited to meet with the police chief and several other officers. This was the first time they met face-to-face since the incident. The meeting was not easy. There were moments of tension and silence, but Jim spoke with honesty and strength. He told them about how the moment he was threatened with a gun had affected him not just physically, but emotionally. He spoke about the fear, the shock, and the feeling of being judged because of his skin color. But he also spoke about hope and the possibility of healing. "I don't want to be an enemy of the police," Jim said quietly. "I want to work with you. I want us to build trust so that no one else has to go through what I did." The officers listened.
Ow.
Some nodded. One young officer, who looked like he wanted to say something but was nervous, finally spoke up. "Double quotes, sir. I want to apologize for what happened. I wasn't there, but I understand the pain it caused. I want to be part of the change." Jim smiled. That moment, small as it was, felt like a bridge being built. Outside of meetings and trainings, the community kept moving forward. Neighborhood groups organized events focused on unity and healing. There were art shows celebrating Black culture, family picnics bringing different races together, forums where people could share their stories safely. Jim became a beloved figure in these events. People admired his calm spirit and courage. He didn't speak often about anger or bitterness. Instead, he talked about the power of forgiveness and understanding. He shared how important it was to stand up, not with violence or hate, but with truth and respect. In the city's schools, the story of Jim Carter became part of the curriculum. Teachers used it to explain the history of civil rights and the ongoing fight for equality. Students read about Jim's life, his military service, and the day the officer pointed a gun at him. Many students were inspired. Some wrote essays about what justice means to them. Others organized clubs focused on community service and anti-racism. One young girl, Maya, wrote a letter to Jim, telling him how his story helped her believe that she could make a difference in the world. Jim kept the letter close. It reminded him that his experience was not just about pain, but about inspiring hope. Even Officer Daniel Brooks had started to face the consequences of his actions beyond losing his job. The department referred his case to the local district attorney's office for possible legal charges. While the legal process was slow and complicated, it sent a message that no one was above the law, especially those sworn to protect and serve. Brooks himself was in a difficult place. He had lost not only his job, but also the respect of his community and family. He entered counseling to deal with his anger and fears. Slowly, he began to confront the biases and fears that had led to his mistake. It was a hard journey, but one he had to take if he wanted to find peace. Meanwhile, Jim's own healing journey continued. Though the city had changed and the police had started reforms, the memory of that day still lingered. He often thought about the fear he felt and the injustice he faced. But he also thought about the people who had stood with him, the strangers, who had shown kindness and the hope that had grown from pain. One evening, Jim sat on his porch with his granddaughter. They watched the sunset, a soft orange glow filling the sky. "Grandpa," she said, "do you think the world is really changing?" Jim looked at her, his eyes gentle but steady. "I believe it is. Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, patience, and courage. But every step we take, every voice we raise, brings us closer to a better future." She smiled and squeezed his hand. "I want to be part of that future." Jim nodded. "And you will be. You already are." The story of James Carter became more than a news headline. It became a symbol of resilience, courage, and the power of standing up for what is right. His life reminded people that even one person's calm strength could spark a movement. Across the city, people talked about Jim's dignity and his refusal to be broken by fear or hate. His story was a lesson for officers and civilians alike. Respect must be earned through actions, not assumptions. That justice means fairness for everyone. And that healing begins when we listen to each other's stories. The community's efforts didn't end with the police reforms. Inspired by Jim, new initiatives were launched to address other issues of inequality. Programs for youth empowerment, job training, and mental health support grew stronger. Local leaders promised to keep listening and to keep working. One of the most powerful moments came when a new memorial was unveiled in the city park. It honored veterans, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens who stood up for justice. Jim was invited to give a speech. He spoke about service to one's country, service to one's community, and service to truth. He said, "We are all called to serve, not just in uniform, but in how we treat each other. When we stand together, when we listen and learn, we build a stronger, kinder world." Tears filled many eyes. Some people clapped softly. The memorial became a place for reflection, healing, and hope. James Carter's journey showed that even in the face of injustice, there was a path forward. It was a path filled with courage, understanding, and the belief that change is possible. The world may never be perfect, but with people like Jim leading the way, it could become a little better, one step at a time.